Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad. Tehami. International lenders, including the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, have trimmed the Pakistan's economic growth forecast for the current fiscal year. The World Bank has projected at the same time about 4 million people are under a threat of falling below the lower middle income poverty line amid the ongoing crisis Pakistan is currently faced with. The World Bank country director for Pakistan says, let me quote, the resolution of Pakistan's economic crisis requires a commitment to sustained macro, fiscal and structural reforms, unquote. The Asian Development Bank at the same time has called for the prompt revival of the IMF program. ADB has expressed the commitment to also support Pakistan's recovery and development plans, and the country director for Asian Development Bank for Pakistan says that Pakistan's economy has the potential to bounce back with a robust macroeconomic and structural reforms, at the same time mentioning certain reasons and keeping at the top the political crisis in Pakistan and the devastation caused by the recent floods in 2022 for the economic woes in Pakistan. Now, when we specifically talk about Time magazine, it has held former Prime Minister Imran Khan responsible for the current economic woes in the country. Let me quote it: if Pakistan's economic woes are reaching a new nadir, the trajectory was established during Khan's term, unquote. Now, we have also seen the incumbent government authorities have repeatedly said there is a distrust between IMF and Pakistani authorities, and that is why the staff level agreement after the 9th review for the release of a tranche of $1.1 billion was because of the distrust between the authorities in Pakistan and the IMF. It was because of Pakistan Tehrik-e-Insaf government backtracking from the agreement it made with the IMF. We'll take a look at all these aspects, and to understand this whole equation, we are honored to have been joined in the studio by Mr. Ali Salman. He is Executive Director, Policy Research Institute of Market Economy. Mr. Salman, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that.
Thank you.
On Skype at the same time, we are being joined by Mr. Shikoh Atif. He is Senior Economist associated with Karachi School of Business and Leadership. Mr. Atif, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. Let me begin the discussion with you, Mr. Ali Salman. Let's begin with this particular interview by PTI Chief Imran Khan with the Time magazine. As I have just quoted one thing from this particular thing, it has held former Prime Minister Imran Khan responsible for the current economic woes Pakistan is faced with. The first and the foremost reason it gives is the revolving door of finance ministers. What sort of an impact do you think did it have with a revolving door of the finance ministers during the Pakistan Tehrik-e-Insaf tenure?
Well, let's have a quick look at the tenure of the PTI 3.5 years in the government. And it is right that they had multiple changes at the helm of the Ministry of Finance. But I think what is more important also is to look at the changes in the policies within the tenure itself. So we had Asad Umar, we had Hafiz Sheikh, and then we had Shaukat Tareen in that tenure. And I would like to...
Some others are also...
others for a very short time, maybe for a week or so.
Yeah.
When we had, I think, Hafiz Sheikh, things beginning to look on the right trajectory. The IMF program, government was taking the IMF program seriously. We could see reform. We could see, for instance, exchange rate policies being on the right trajectory, and we could see other reform progress. But I think with coming of Shaukat Tareen, all of that was reversed, and that was this yearning for the votes, for populism, that then government Shaukat Tareen and Prime Minister of course Imran Khan then announced freezing of petroleum prices till for a few months. That was the beginning of the current crisis Pakistan is. But it's not to say that we can put all the blame on that one decision, but that one decision was certainly the first step where we lost the fiscal stability.
So what does
which
that
we're
depict? The
achieving.
continuous change in the finance ministry at the hem, that frequency of the change. I mean,
Well,
four
that
finance
change
ministers
depicted
and
that,
one, you, as you
that
already
always
mentioned.
depicts one thing, that whatever government, is in the power, it does not have a clear plan what to do. And this was despite the announcement which we always hear, that okay, we have a plan for the future, we have we know what to do, but then when it comes to actual practice, you don't have, you see that the plan is not there. Then you take a lot of time in learning. Any new finance minister would come, would take a lot of time learning, and that is what happened. And then we saw similar things. For instance, even in last 1 year, when Miftah Ismail came and then Ishaq Dar came, we see a lot of time being wasted in that learning process. And then when it comes to countries like Pakistan, where you have a significant crisis and decisions are to be made, and sometimes at a short notice, and then you have crises like you have COVID crisis, you had floods and devastation of floods, and your monetary policy, or especially fiscal policy, is not clear, is not certain. You're changing within the budget year. So that gives a lot of mistrust, lot of lack of confidence to the national investors or international investors.
So that shows that before Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf came into the government, it didn't have that very clear idea how to run the country's economy. Am I correct?
They did have some idea. I remember Asad Umar saying very first time when he was made finance minister that we will not go into privatization, and he announced this formation of a company called Sarmaya Pakistan, following Malaysian model or Singaporean Khazana model. Now, to say it that we will not do privatization and we will do maybe corporate restructuring, corporate governance is one thing, and to really understand it and run it is totally something else. So that plan totally failed. So there were maybe some of these notions which they have in their minds, but I think the reality was very different. And that's why I'm saying that if you have a plan, the plan needs to be realistic, that plans need to be to conform to economic fundamentals. That is where I think the previous government totally failed. And I'm afraid the current government is also failing in that respect.
It is because of that kind of foundation that's been set, what the incumbent government authorities often allude to, the wrong and unclear policies of the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf government. Mr. Shikoh, Atif, what do you think about this very frequency of the change of the finance ministers during the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf government? As the Time magazine says, if the Pakistan's economic woes are reaching a new nadir, the trajectory was established during the Khan's term.
There is certainness that a publication like Time magazine is not trying to be pro this party or another. It's an objective economic point of view. What I would say is there are certain jobs that you cannot have on-the-job training. You have to be ready. Unfortunately, they were not prepared to take the helms at that time. 2 or 3 mistakes that they made, we are still trying to reap what they sowed at that time. Number one, they delay with approaching IMF. Number two, they subsequently, when they joined, they helped Pakistan lose its credibility completely with IMF by making a promise and 15 days later breaking it up, going completely against it. And so IMF doesn't care if it's Imran Khan, Shehbaz Sharif, or X, Y, Z. To them, they're dealing with Pakistan. Pakistan, the country, lost its credibility. But the most important thing, and which is even today at KSBL, we talk a little bit about what the solutions out of this problem are today. So the one issue that one mistake, actually a couple of mistakes that they made in the arena of foreign ministry at that time, we are paying for right now. Number one was how they approached CPEC at that time, and the tremendous disappointment that China had with Pakistan. And China is our biggest lender even today. The damage that was done to the relationship at that time even shackles us at this time to go back to China and say, let's restructure our debts. Because at KSBL, we think restructuring of our debts with China might be the way. The number two, this is cheap populism. As an economist and with other economists, we find that our sort of cheap populism with cutting down trade with India and some of the other countries, which is great sloganism, but at that time that he did without an idea of how this impacts the common man. At that time, it was cheap, of course, but that had profound economic impact on Pakistani economy and continues to have it up until now. The one last thing I would say is I know for a fact two things. One, that our present Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif is looked at with tremendous respect in China. I know that for a fact. Number two, I agreed to come on to your program, Jawad, because I know for a fact that individuals from the World Bank and IMF follow and watch your program very diligently. So, just so they know that we appreciate what they're doing for us, and we'll work with them to get out of the present quandary.
Right, Mr. Shikoh, Atif, now backtracking from the agreement made with the IMF, the second reason that you've just highlighted that led to the loss of credibility with the IMF or the Pakistani authorities. How detrimental it was, first of all, delaying going to the IMF, and then after going to the IMF and then backtracking from the agreement they had with IMF. So how detrimental it was for the overall outlook of the Pakistan's economy?
So unfortunately, as an individual, he might be a tremendous individual, and I don't want to but I know for a fact that the first meeting that IMF had with Mr. Omar, after that, they just refused to deal with him. They said, there is a level of economic education that is required here. So again, for them, if it's Mr. Umar or X, Y, and Z, it doesn't really matter. They're dealing with Pakistan. But I know for a fact that that's how disappointed they were. You mentioned the backtracking. After the backtracking, there is absolutely, that's why they want, like with Sri Lanka, with all other nations, when those nations go to IMF and they say, we have these commitments from other nations that they will lend us this money. IMF says absolutely correct. Let's sign the staff level agreement. With us, because of that drowning of our credibility, they just don't believe us because of that thing. Now they say, no, get the money first and then we will do the staff level agreement. So it's that lack of credibility and what we did at that time, backtracking on the promises that we made. That's what we are sort of suffering from at the present moment.
Right, your point is well taken. Let me proceed to Mr. Ali Salman. Now, Mr. Ali, we saw that former Prime Minister Imran Khan in 2018 categorically saying that in order to end Pakistan's cycle of debt, we are not going to approach IMF. But less than half a year later, he struck a deal with IMF. So what was intrinsically wrong with approaching the IMF late?
Well, I think the fundamental realization where our economy is in terms of the growth structure, in terms of its capacity to increase its export income, or its tendency to always overspend than the tax resources we are earning. So if you ignore these facts, then obviously it is very possible that you enter into a balance of payment crisis, right? So IMF is the sort of the lending agency which helps the countries when they are in balance of payment crisis. And if you don't realize that, then obviously you're fundamentally wrong, and anyone. But the second part is that it provides always a window of support. And during that window, then the country in that IMF program needs to do certain things. Needs to do, for instance, if in the case of Pakistan, for instance, increasing that tax base, improving the tax structure. In our view, reduction of tax rates is very important. Privatization is important. Cutting down public spending is important. The state-owned enterprises, we need to fix that. That is important. So there are a number of things which it is perhaps well known. I mean, I'm not adding here anything new, but then we did nothing of that, right? So. And that is where we fail to convince our international partners that we are serious about reforms, and that was perhaps the beginning of the lack of the trust which we are today discussing. But I would like to take the discussion forward, if you allow me, and we need to look at, I think, more closely into also what has happened in last one and a half year, and see that why now, despite of our best intentions in revival of the IMF program, because the current government, the PDM government, came with this notion, with this promise that look, country was going to a default position because of these problems. We will fix it by going back to the IMF program, and to some extent, it followed the conditions. For instance, the interest rate, the discount rate has even yesterday has gone up tremendously. It is now 21%. This is perhaps the highest in decades we have seen. But it is not going to control the inflation rate on its own. Also, the exchange rate was allowed to adjust to the market forces.
The cap was removed.
The cap was removed. So that was the conditions from IMF. But at the same time, what the government is doing.
The supplementary finance bill also
to
garner 1,700 billion rupees.
But look at the other steps. Look at the fact, for instance, we had a very well established social protection program, BIS program, and our group, Economic Advisory Group, has also recently released a public statement about it, that we should have adopted a cash transfer from that rather than distributing atta free in public like that. So when you enter into in IMF program, you cannot unilaterally.
That happens to be a very challenging kind of a corridor, or a narrow corridor for the government authorities, in order to give that kind of respite to the common people also were burdened by the kind of difficult conditions, the prior actions the IMF had set, and the government fulfilled its promise of meeting those.
What is interesting, look, for instance, in Sindh, you have a coalition partner, People's Party, right? So it's part of the PTM, integral part of the PTM. But look at how they are doing. They are not setting up free atta distribution centers. They have just created an additional cash transfer for Ramadan month through the BIS program.
So, but that shouldn't be the reason for the delay in the signing of the staff level
That's
agreement.
one of the reasons.
Okay, so
actually, when you talk 100 billion rupees,
many of the reasons, as the government removed the price cap, also the supplementary finance bill to garner 1,700 billion rupees, also increasing the tariff of electricity and fuel prices also.
Let me add one more thing. I mean, when you are in the program, so when we are in the program, the reality is that you cannot take these decisions like, okay, for instance, we will provide petrol to motorcyclists at a reduced rate, and we will provide petrol to the car owners at a higher rate. So you can't play with market like that, and even under normal functional economy, you should not be doing it. And if you are in the IMF program, you cannot do that.
But at the same time, the government has to look into this fact also, not to burden the common man also.
So that was where we started from back in 1.5 years ago. This was the whole logic which Imran Khan was then selling, that I need to protect these people, and then we ended up in a worse scenario for everyone, and worse off for those people who are are not earning that much. So whenever you have these subsidies, the major advantage does not go to the poor people. It goes to the higher income people, because they are actually the larger consumers of fuel, for instance. So it is well known, but unfortunately our government refuses to learn.
Right, Mr. Shikoh, Atif, what's your take regarding this? Despite we have seen government taking tough decisions, meeting those prior actions, some of those of the IMF to get that staff level agreement done, but it is still pending. What are the reasons why it is still pending? We have seen international organizations, including the Human Rights Watch, also urging the IMF to give Pakistan some space for sustainable recovery.
The major factor is what I mentioned earlier on, is the credibility gap. Number two, then there is some tension between China and the US at the present moment, because US has such a tremendous influence on the IMF. They have concerns that that China should have a lot of outlay into this, so they want to they're playing a little bit of a game with each other, that China should have greater outlay and of support, greater risk, and they are also concerned that we might borrow from IMF and give to China. So we are suffering from that tension. Number two, then there is, as time passes, the conclusion that myself and some colleagues came to, that at the end of the day, the solution is to go to China and seek a restructuring of our present debt. And you were talking about the previous government, the PTI government. In those 4 years, Pakistan borrowed more than Pakistan borrowed during the past 70 odd years of its existence. So that's where we sowed what we are reaping at this time. So it's just those 4 years that we borrowed so much that we don't have the capability of paying back at the present moment. And then there were some contracts that were signed with the IPPs, which is independent power producers, and even some Chinese companies, some companies by local businessmen at that time, that were so detrimental to the economy of Pakistan that, whether they produce or they do not, Pakistan has to pay them in US dollars. So that's a tremendous outlay of foreign currency, and detrimental contracts were signed. If there was one mistake that the country, I would say, I don't want to pick on a party, but during that time that Pakistanis, even though I'm just agreeing with Time magazine, and that's why I'm taking the PTI's name, was in the area of energy. At that time, because of COVID, the gas and the fuel prices were way low. Now, one thing that the government at that time, Pakistan government at that time, led by PTI, could have done, they could have secured Pakistan energy situation for decades to come by buying it in futures at that very low prices. But because their level of sophistication and knowledge was not where it ought to be, because they were all practicing on the economy and other areas, they were unable to see what was coming. And that's why there is this dearth in Pakistan of a long-term economic point of view. But there was such short-termism that was seen during that time has never been seen in Pakistan's economy, to my knowledge.
Right, Mr. Ali Salman, do you want to add anything to this particular thing which has been put forth by Mr. Shikoh Atif regarding the energy sector and the kind of strategy and the policy PTI government pursued at that very time?
I totally agree with that. I think then government lost significant opportunities in terms of the future contracts. Remember, the previous government, PMLN government, had successfully diversified the energy mix. We began to procure LNG contracts, which actually improved energy mix, which brought the average cost of producing electricity actually down, despite our reliance on fossil fuels. So that should have been continued. But then remember, we went into accountability drive, the national accountability. Shahid Khan Nawasi was put behind bar. And it's all that kind of problems which were started.
A delay in acquiring the containers of LNG also. That was also acknowledged by the then Finance Minister, Mr. Shaukat Tareen also.
That's right. I mean, and especially when you are, I remember, meeting the former CEO of the LNG company and many people like that who were involved previously in these decisions. But they were always under pressure from NAB, or they were facing inquiries when there was no one actually on the decision making. And when you have no one who would make these decisions, obviously you would lose that opportunity, which was rightly identified. So that's what one of the examples of, I think, poor economic management which we did witness in that time.
So, Mr. Ali, in that very interview, the Time magazine also goes on to say there was little done as far as increasing or broadening the tax base was concerned. And it mentions in 2021, only 2.5 million Pakistanis filed tax returns, less than 1% of the adult population. Why couldn't the PTI government increase that tax base?
Well, that's a chronic problem again. I mean, it's not just PTI government, it's previous PMLN government, the current government. We can blame them for that. I think the fundamental problem is that they always look, they do not look at the tax rate, they always look at, for instance, the current revenue collection, they look at the import as revenue collection. They do not even consider reducing the tax rates, which they should. In our opinion, the income tax rate, the sales tax rates and customs duties are too high at the moment. We need to bring them down, but no one considers that. We always consider, okay, extracting the maximum revenue from the current high income earners, I think, which is not the way forward. And also looking at just import as vehicle of taxation, which is currently the case, is again a wrong policy. And this is something which we have seen over decades. It's, when we talk about PTI, of course, because there were a lot of expectations from the government, from the PTI government in terms of reforms, governance reforms. So that's why perhaps we can
so
actually
evaluate
the kind of
time period, 3.5 years almost, the kind of time period Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf government had got. Was there any serious chance of bringing the macro fiscal and structural reforms in Pakistan's economy?
Oh yes, I think the country enjoyed that reasonable level of political stability, and as it is well known, even the institutional stakeholders were famously on the same page. And the opposition was also in disarray, and in that respect, I think Imran Khan's government had a good chance of putting the fiscal and monetary policy on the right track. But then it needed the economic knowledge, which unfortunately we did not observe in that time. So the opportunity was huge, but it was lost.
Right. Mr. Shikoh, Atif, what should necessarily be done in order to increase the tax base in Pakistan? As the Time magazine mentions that in 2021, when Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf was in the government, only 2.5 million Pakistanis filed tax returns. At that very time, we frequently heard about this slogan of increasing the tax base by the leaders of Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf. Why do you think it couldn't formulate a strategy to increase that base?
Unfortunately, it was comprised by people who had tremendous conflict of interest. So, for example, the cigarette manufacturers were sitting in the parliament representing on the right and the left of the prime minister. And that is why a cigarette at that time, the same cigarette sold in Australia, was 28 times more expensive than it was in Pakistan, because they tax a cigarette and we do not. Now, when this government has come in, for the first time, they have taxed cigarettes, they have taxed real estate transactions. With all due respect to IMF and our friends at the World Bank, I would say this: they place too much emphasis on sales taxes. Now, one thing that is clear is, because even though the sales tax is 18-19% in Pakistan right now, or some atrocious number, because of their sort of emphasis and their understanding of a sales tax, the tax base in Pakistan has only gone up, the tax collection has only gone up very minimally. So their emphasis a lot on indirect taxation and not direct taxation is one of the causes. I know for a fact that in 2016 and 2017, and regardless of which political party anyone represents, there is not one Pakistani who would not want a time machine to take them back to 2016 and 2017. 2016, when we as Pakistanis completed our one and only IMF program. And 2017, 2016, when the economy was doing so well and we were on target to be one of the top 20 economies in the world. And right now we are on track to be, well, it is tough at the present moment. To finally answer your question, to increase the tax base, this government is doing as much as it possibly can. But right now, they have to balance this between maintaining the business sentiment of the country and is enlarging the tax base. So too soon, and just the one thing that we keep forgetting is the macro international environment is very, very different from what it was even in 2021. It is so much harder right now all over the globe, not only Pakistan. So when things go tough in Pakistan, we always blame the government. Who is the government? Who's in power? Not that. We have to see where is Pakistan located. It's in on the globe. It's in Asia. So when things get tough, so for example, interest rates are up all across the world. So just that real that understanding.
Right, Mr. Alisman, I think you had something to
I just
add
want to add one point here, and with a slight amount of slightly disagreement here, and that is, mentioned also some in our Charter of Economy, which I hope that we can talk in the future. But in terms of the tax rates and how the economy is designed, there is often this misconception that a secular increase in the tax rate would automatically increase the tax revenue. It doesn't happen like that, right? So many centuries ago, Ibn Khaldun taught us, and then many decades ago, Arthur Laffer taught us that it doesn't happen. If you keep increasing the tax rate, the ultimately tax revenue will fall down, because more and more people will stop filing the tax returns, and they will go into the informal market, or they will stop doing work. And actually, cigarette industry is a good example of bad tax policies. So what has happened recently, if you just look at, yes, it is, we know that the public health is always an issue here, but I'm looking at just from a taxation point of view. So 2 or 3 months ago, the excise taxation on cigarette was increased tremendously. Now, as a result of that, the recent figures suggest that the informal market share has increased tremendously, which means that the consumption hasn't gone down. It has stayed the same, but people have switched to substitutes, and the government is going to lose tax revenue because it has increased tax rates without looking into actual market situation.
But if that is the case,
because people cannot afford expensive products. When you add taxation, of course, the product price will go significantly. So that is going to happen if you increase the general sales tax and try to not reform the overall tax structure. People will tend to go to informal market. That is a fundamental economic misconception.
So what about the monitoring system? You have just quoted Ibn Khaldun from history. Right now, we live in an advanced age, so there could be a robust monitoring system in order to curtail that fall, disproportionate fall against increasing the sales tax up.
No monitoring system in the world can change human incentives. So human incentives do not change. And if you keep taxing income, people will have an incentive of reducing the work or taking their income outside the tax bracket or tax system.
So how to correct that?
So the solution is very simple. The solution is you have to have a very simplified tax structure at low rate, where you can cover the broadest base possible, and then you ensure that the compliance is there, right? So right now the compliance
how to ensure compliance?
So you need to
where a monitoring mechanism has to come into play, right?
Monitoring mechanism, obviously there has to be an efficient tax machinery. No one is disputing that. But first of all, you need to address the system before you address the tax administration. So we try to only address the tax administration, talking about compliance, talking about the administration, talking about technology. So we are very fond of using technology. Technology can only fix a few things, but it cannot change the system. The system is about the tax rate. It's not about just compliance, and that is I think major shift which needs to happen in our current tax policy.
Right, Mr. Shikoh, Atif, when we talk about the security situation in a certain country, we have seen that the Time magazine also quotes one of the scholars, let me quote it. It was Khan, Mr. Imran Khan, alluding to the fact that who was pushing for talks with the Taliban, the banned Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, at all costs. Now, this has been referred to Mr. Kuhlman of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Now, he goes on to say that Embrace is now experiencing significant levels of blowback. Now, when we talk about the kind of economic challenges the country is already faced with, and then the kind of increase in the terrorism-related incidents and the subsequent deaths, how do you correlate that, and how do you see that particular decision of going into negotiations and the policy of appeasement towards the banned Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan was detrimental to the overall economy in Pakistan?
Sure. The banned Tehrik-e-Taliban in Pakistan, but even prior to that, his welcoming of the transition to Taliban rule from the Afghan government at the time, because we were all, and he was all, like applauding the change in the government, and I quote him that they have thrown away the shackles and now Taliban are going to come, and without appreciating and understanding the economic disastrous impact that would have on Pakistan. You know, the exchange rate, which has gone tremendously to 280, 290 at this time. Pakistan rupee has depreciated. You know which currency has appreciated on the basis of the dollars of Pakistan? The Afghan rupee. That is how much dollars from Pakistan are being smuggled to Afghanistan. At that time, because of the so many Afghanis living in Pakistan in the present, and at that time, a lot of that currency was actually flowing into Pakistan. Now, for no matter what the price of the US dollar is in Pakistan, Afghanis are willing to pay 10 to 20% more on that and take the money back to Afghanistan. And that is one area where I would respectfully address the IMF and the World Bank people. Please don't force our government to set our exchange rates according to what the Afghanistan demand is. Because they keep suggesting, take it 10% more, 20% more. Because if we take it to 10, 20% more, Afghanis are just going to want to pay 20% more on that. And then where does it end? So that is all as a response to, again, what I said at the very beginning, the cheap sloganism, cheap populism. You know, you get applause for a moment, but you don't see in the future. You mentioned that the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan. Unfortunately, I am in Karachi at the present moment. There are very few people who feel safe in the country at the present time. Again, we think about where this country was in 2016, 2017. The whole mindset is different, and that was all welcomed.
And that naturally reduces the investor confidence also.
Absolutely right. You hit the nail on the head. It's all about the business sentiment, and the biggest damage that Mr. Imran Khan has done and continues to do is to wash our dirty laundry in public. He goes on these foreign missions, he talks to these foreign media. I've never seen any leader do this to his own country, regardless of what all across the world. They think of the nation first because they are held accountable for it.
Right. Mr. Ali Salman, your take regarding this particular thing, the investor confidence and the security situation and former Prime Minister Imran Khan's decision of going into negotiations with the banned Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, how detrimental was it for the investor sentiment?
Well, I think there is certainly a degree of truth there that the sort of the U-turn in our Afghan policy was not ultimately proven beneficiary for Pakistan. Afghanistan's own domestic situation has been very complex, and it is unfortunate that in 20 long years of US administration support, the Afghan society could not develop of its, in the institutions of its own. The democracy was not really nurtured beyond, limited, let's say, cities. And you had a lot of other problems. You had corruption. So those are all the problems which Afghans really faced. But that was Afghanistan's problem, not ours problem. And when we begin to own problems which are not ours, then of course we are just increasing risk for ourselves. But on the particular economic issue of the exchange rate and the border, and I would like to clarify that yes, currently it is the case that the dollar demand is significantly higher at the border, but it was absent before we started hoarding dollars, or before we starting restricting imports, or before we started restricting the price of the dollar, because all of these steps which were taken with the government in the last 1 year gave a signal to our importers, to exporters, that they can actually find other ways to import. They can find illegal, quote unquote, informal ways to import. And then, of course, then multiple rates of dollar were introduced, which was a problem which we had solved.
The ban on imports was actually intended to narrow down the current account deficit, and it has narrowed down.
It has narrowed down the current account deficit at a significant cost. It has also closed down industry. It has also caused job losses at a significant scale, and it has also contributed to inflation.
So one last point, unfortunately we're short of time now. Asian Development Bank, the country director for Pakistan, has expressed the hope that Pakistan's economy has the potential to bounce back with robust macroeconomic and structural reforms. How sooner we could expect that happening?
Well, if it is only ADB or World Bank saying it, then I'm not very hopeful. Unfortunately, the incentives there are also not aligned with the real results. The real results and the ownership of reform have to come from political parties, political leadership of the country, and not at donors' demand. Unless that begins to happen, we will not see any reforms really.
Right. Mr. Shikoh, Atif, your quick take regarding this particular expression of hope by Asian Development Country Director for Pakistan, that Pakistan's economy has the potential to bounce back. How soon can we expect that one happening? And how important and crucial political stability in the country is for that?
Well, ADB quoted just today that next year inflation is going to be 15%. In the same article that you're kindly quoting. So we are all heading towards the right direction. Things have turned around. Now, right now, Sri Lanka is way worse than we are. As the impact of the devastation of the floods dissipates, and the funds from international, the funds that were promised come into the country, and if we can structure our debts with China, we can start thinking again about what Pakistan looked like in 2016 and 2017.
Right, Mr. Shikoh Atif joining us on Skype, senior economist associated with Karachi School of Business and Leadership. Thank you very much for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate your time. And in the studio, we were joined by Mr. Ali Salman, Executive Director, Policy Research Institute of Market Economy. Thank you very much for being with us on the show tonight. We really appreciate that. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Till the next one, take good care of yourselves.